I've known John since he came with IBM because I was the one who hired him, and I knew him from before the days that he was an IBMer. Immediately before that. I didn't know him until immediately before he was hired.
Did you interviewed him yourself?
Yes, I of course interviewed him, but we were looking for about 20 people to augment the Stretch project. We wanted to find people with some very special characteristics. We wanted people of the highest possible intellect. We also wanted people with excellent academic credentials in the fields of mathematics and linguistics, things of that sort. We wanted to have people who were pleasant to be with, who made good team people, but on the other hand, people who wouldn't be so overwhelmed by a team that they couldn't do original work and sometimes bring a team around to a new direction. And John seemed to be the kind of person, just the kind of person we were looking for, and he has proven to be that. And so it's very gratifying to see now, a third of a century later, that that we were right in our assessment of him. John was only one of 3 people that we employed from Duke. Our original attention to Duke came when we were tracking down Sullivan Campbell. Dr. Campbell had been a meteorologist in World War II. After World War II, he had gone back to school and got a doctorate in mathematics. He had then gone to Oak Ridge and worked with computers there. I think he was he was in the computer science department. I think he was head of their computer science department at Oak Ridge. He then went to Duke and headed the computer science department there. And so our first, he came first to our attention, and we made arrangements to employ him, which took a little doing because he had a 6-month contract. He had to complete his academic year. This was in the middle of the year. This was about December, January, and he wouldn't leave in the middle of an academic year, so we hired him, and for 6 months he worked with us from Duke, working on the mostly on the arithmetic mechanism of the machine, which seemed to be a thing that he could work on there pretty much as well as he could in Poughkeepsie. So we made that arrangement with him. At the same time, he told us that in his department he had 2 very able young men that he wanted to bring to our attention. One of them was John Cocke, the other was Tianchi Chen, that we all know as TC. And so we discussed what we were doing with them, and to our delight, they both also joined Sully and came with us at the end of that academic year. So I don't know exactly when he came with us, but it was after he finished his academics. John had not finished his dissertation, and one of the considerations in hiring him was that he must finish his dissertation and get his doctorate. And so for the first year or so, we were trying to get the most we could out of John, at the same time push him as hard as we could to finish up his remaining work so they could get his doctorate, which he did in quite on time and in due course. And that was the way in which the 3 of them were hired. All right, well, we had, at the time John came, we already had committed ourselves to build the machine, so we knew it was we were going to go ahead with the project. But we also knew that we would never make it unless we had more and better people to work with, and so he came at the very beginning of the project. We knew what our goals were. We knew pretty much what we had to work with. But we didn't know how to put the machine together, and that led into these broad questions, including the one that he addressed himself to immediately, which was the question of how to structure a machine to get the most out of it, to make it run as fast as possible. And this is a problem that involves one both in the hardware that you have and also in the objectives you have for the machine. So it became a question of how could we make a machine that would do the kinds of things that, for example, the Atomic Energy Commission and the National Security Agency would be interested in having machines for. And so John's job, his part of the thing, along with Harwood Kolsky and Dick Balance and John Griffith, was to ascertain the nature of the problems that we should aim to solve, and then determine the best, most efficient structure for the machine for that. Since the software, the hardware, had some shortcomings, the memory wasn't as fast as we would like it to be. We, for example, had to interleave memories. Well, how many memories should we interleave? We finally wound up with interleaving 4 memories. And then there was another question. We had a faster cache memory. How much effect would this have? And how would that be balanced against the costs and the difficulties of designing it? So finally it turned out we made one, and for a machine for the National Security Agency. We did not make it for the other stretch machines because we found that the look-ahead mechanism, the system that he had, made the machine work with more or less the same efficiency without it. It wasn't that the cache memory wouldn't have helped, but it wasn't an absolute essential, and we had enough problems without adding that one more to it. So this was the area in which John went, and there had been no one working on it before him. He and the others working with him were breaking new ground. No one, as far as I know, no one had ever simulated a computer in this way before. No one had ever endeavored to make a computer that multiplexed its operation. In other words, in all previous computers, the parts, the total speed of the machine was determined by the speed of the individual parts, and there had never been a machine in which there were several memories that one could work with different cycles, so that one could be reading out of one of these memories some data while one was looking up the next instruction in another of the memories that one wanted to, where one wanted to get the information. So it was all technically new ground, and he got in the beginning of it and dove in and did his part.
What did you do?
Well, I had the problem of, in general, first of all, of getting the staff together, getting the organization together, giving a general tone to the direction in which the thing would go, and establishing some general standards for what we should do, and that was enough of a job. And so the way we worked, actually, was that we divided, the job was much too big for any small number of people to handle, so we divided it up in parts, and then we would assign an engineer or a group to each one of these parts. We had a group of people that worked on the frames. We had another group of people who worked on the circuits for the machine, another that worked on the circuit cards and how they should run, another worked on the power supplies. We had John working on the general system organization. We had other people working on the language and just what we should do in the way of language and that sort of thing. One of the rules of the project, which I think was a new sort of thing, was that we required each group to specify, to describe in detail how they would approach their part of the problem and why they were going to approach it and what other approaches they had considered and why they had rejected these other approaches and chosen the one that they did. As a result of that, there is a very extensive documentation of the Stretch project as to why, for example, why we chose an 8-bit byte and what the logic was behind that. And that stuck with us, and it was a real good choice, and it stuck with us, and we know now what considerations went on the thing. Incidentally, it was one of the members of the Stretch project that came up with the word byte that's now in the dictionary. So one of our people, that was Werner Buchholz, and the word byte, and I well remember the discussions and how it had to be spelled B-Y-T-E to distinguish it from bit, and so that it would be easily distinguishable. So this was the way in which the thing was put together, and as a result of that, we have a document that was written by John and by Harwood Kolsky and Dick Balance that describes the look-ahead mechanism, how it worked, and why they designed it to work the way they did. When the project was nearing an end, Werner Buchholz, who handled the overall systems design of the Stretch machine, put together a set of papers which described the individual parts. What he did was to collect the individual stretch project papers and edit them a little bit, and then put them together as a volume which described what we went through, why we went through it. And interestingly enough, the stretch papers which were put together in that document were later translated into Russian, because the USSR decided that it would provide one of the best guides to their engineers on how to make future machines. And one of the very interesting aspects of the Stretch project is the Russian translator's explanation of why he chose this set of papers for translation. Unfortunately, there's only one copy of that document in the United States. The Russians don't make copies of things like that for regular sale. They only make enough to go in their libraries, and that's it. I never could get a copy, but the translator sent one copy to Werner. And as far as I know, that's the only copy of the Russian translation that is outside of USSR. Now with things opened up, one of my hopes is that somehow I can snag a copy out of some backwash over there. We'll wait to see. So I will start over here with respect to the Russian translation.
Yes.
Werner Buchholz's book, which put together the most significant of the Stretch documents, was published and was used extensively in colleges and universities as a guide for the design of future computers. And the USSR thought well enough of it to have it translated into Russian. As far as I know, there's only one copy of the Russian translation in the United States. That's one that the translator sent to Werner Buchholz. And there's a very interesting translator's introduction which explains why it is that the USSR thought that this book was worthy of translation. I tried at the time to get a copy for my own use, but the practice in USSR is to make enough copies to go in all their schools and libraries, and to stop at that, make 4 or 5 more copies, and you're done with it. They don't put those things up for sale in the same way that we do in this country. So I was unable to get one, and it's my hope now that with the better relations with USSR, there may be some way, someday, that we can gain access to at least one more copy of the Russian translation of the Stretch book. I might, are we on?
Yep.
All right, okay.
Okay, but you have to wait and I tell them to be silent before we start again.
I want to tell you another anecdote about John.
Okay, silence.
One of the things that is illustrative of the relationship that John had to the rest of us, and the ways in which he was able to be helpful to us, is something that happened to me when I was working on the automatic error correction for Stretch. We knew very well that a machine of that size was not going to work unless we could equip it with automatic error correction, not only detection but correction. And incidentally, that worked very well, and the result of that was that the Stretch machine was one of the most reliable machines of its generation. And it had a very, very, big as it was, it had a very, very excellent reputation for reliability, and for being down for very rarely, and for being down for short spaces of time. The automatic error correction also told you where the trouble was, so that it made it very much quicker to fix than would otherwise have been the case. Early on, we decided that Dick Hamming's code would be used for the automatic error correction on the channels and in the memory and in most places. But it wasn't adequate in some other respects, and so, or wasn't as good as it might have been in some other respects. For example, for use on tapes and for use on the disk files, both of which had automatic error corrections. And we automatic error corrected the tapes as well, because again, we knew that with what we knew about the tapes and what we were demanding of them, they weren't going to work unless we could do that. But the Hamming code wasn't really, it didn't take care of bunched errors of the kind that we knew would happen on disks and on tape. We knew that if the tape flew off the head momentarily, you weren't going to get one bit gone, you were going to lose a whole bunch of bits. So we were looking at other codes, and I was mulling the thing over with the yellow pad in front of me in my office when John dropped in and sat down, and I explained to him what I was thinking about and what I was doing and the intellectual problems I was having with trying to understand this whole thing and what it was. And I described to him where I stood and what I was doing. And after a few minutes of cogitation, John said to me, "Well, you know, Red, that's a Galois field. What you've got is a Galois field. If you do it this way, if you look at the thing this way, you have not only all those solutions that you've just shown me, but you have all these others." And sure enough, he taught me in a short space of time what a Galois field was, and we realized that we had many more opportunities, many more ways of going about these things than we had understood. And here we had John drawing from his very considerable knowledge of mathematics, and in a way that none of us had anticipated. How one one wouldn't expect that studying Galois fields in college would lead to any useful purpose in how to do automatic error correction in a computer, but it does. It does, and John knew it did, and knew how to he knew how to apply it, and that was the kind of thing that we did along the way. Another aspect of John's career was the long hours that he worked. The rest of us would work during the day, and we'd go home exhausted, hoping that the next morning we could somehow survive another day of this sort of thing. But John would, after he'd concluded with us, then he'd go on and start doing the things that he wanted to think about, and there was the whole night to spend before the next day came on, and also so he was often off on other tangents at times like that. At one point, I got a telephone call. The telephone rang beside the bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I picked up the phone, and it was a guard at IBM. And the guard said, "There's a young man here that's outstanding looking at the reflecting pool." The 701 building was in the shape of a U, and there was a reflecting pool in the middle of it that had water in it about 6 inches deep. And he said, "This young man is out here, and he's acting kind of strange, and he said, though, that if I would call you, maybe it would be all right." And I said, "Well, what's his name?" "Well, his name is John Cocke." I said, "Of course, he's just working." And I said, "Leave him alone. He does his best work this way, and don't ever bother him." And I think the guard thought that John was about to commit suicide in 6 inches of water or something like that. But he was merely working. And so John was very, very productive, because he put up with all the things the rest of us had to put up with, and then somehow he found time for other things as well. John's mind ranged over many different fields above and beyond the things that we were directly working on. And in those early days, he kept discussing with us a thing he called the money card. And anyone who knew John early on will recognize the money card. The money card, he said, was a little piece of plastic you could carry in your wallet, and whenever you wanted to buy something, you put this thing in a box and it would charge the purchase to your bank account. And if you ran out of money, all you had to do was push a button, and out would come some money that you could put in your wallet until you got to the next card. Well, now that, obviously, he was describing credit cards. However, you have to remember that this was at a very early time. There was no teleprocessing at the time. No computers talked to other computers at the time. We were having great difficulty getting one end of this computer to talk to the other end, let alone to think of such other broad things. But John had already had his mind on where we were going to be 20, 30 years beyond, and that was typical of John. It was the way things went. Another aspect of John was a question of how you manage a person like this. And I found that he and I had a relationship that worked out very, very well. I had a very excellent way of managing John. It was very simple. I would ask John what he was going to do, and then I'd agree. And it worked very well, and he never disappointed himself, and he never disappointed me, and many good things came out of that, much more than would have been the case if I had tried to tell him what I thought he ought to do. However, that approach to things led to certain kinds of problems. John had he suffered from a problem, along with Tom Watson Jr., that not everyone else does, and that was he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. John really didn't have to worry about money. He worked because he wanted to work. He worked because he had objectives, and those objectives were important to him, and he worked as hard as anyone could possibly work on those things, but it wasn't the money that, that led him to do it. John had been working at the Poughkeepsie Laboratory. He'd come and work with us for a week, and then he'd go out to Los Alamos and work for a week and talk to the mathematicians out there about their problems and how to best solve them, and what's the best way, and how could we relate this machine to the problems, all of which had to do with his look ahead and the structure of the machine that he was advising us on. But these trips ran up to quite a considerable amount of money, but without my realizing it, John had never turned in any expense accounts. I wasn't aware of it until one day he came in with a big brown bag full of expense accounts that went back for something like 1.5 years. And he said, you know, Red, don't you think I ought to be paid for this? And we both agreed that he should be paid for it. And so typically we turned all this stuff over to someone else who would write it all down, because he had all the papers. What he'd done every time he had an airplane ticket, he'd charge it to his own account and stuff it in a drawer. And this had gone on for quite some period of time. And so we did this, and so here it was June or July, and I took this big stack of expense account into the controller and said that we needed somehow to take care of this. And they all went back to almost all of the previous year, and we all know how controllers are about going back and adjusting the figures for last year for any substantial sum of money. At which point the controller explained to me that managers were demoted forever for less than this, and that the problem was mine. It wasn't John's problem, it was my problem for letting John do a thing like this. And I had to explain to the controller that I didn't manage John. John managed me, and somehow it all worked out. And he got his money, and they didn't demote me, and so some way that little thing worked out. But again, it was a reflection of the fact that John always worked because he wanted to work, and not because he had to work. And that is characterized, that's one of the characteristics of his life. I have not had close contact with John through much of his career. Our careers have diverged to a certain degree, but we've always remained very good friends. And about 3 years ago, I had an occasion, I was working with someone else on the structure of the words in the English language. What kind of prefixes and suffixes do we have, and things of that sort in this language, which we've inherited from, which is a melange of so many other languages. It isn't a well-designed thing, it's just a happening. And so it occurred to me that we decided that we would like to have a good cross-section of the language without keying it in the machine ourselves, and my first reaction was to call John. And sure enough, John had a list for us, and that would be typical, you know. And so John had a list for us, and which he gave to us, and gave us 100,000 or so words from the English language that we could then put in our computer. It was all on a tape, and put in our computer and work with to our heart's content. While I was talking to John, we got into a discussion of translations, and he told me that at that time he was working on the relationship of French and English. That he had found that in Quebec, which was legally bilingual, they were requiring, the legislature was required to publish all of its laws in 2 languages, in French and English. And of course this has to be a very precise, the relationship is demanded that as little as possible license be taken in the translation. And so it was an ideal opportunity to compare languages and see how languages relate to one another. And here we have 2 languages that are really very closely related anyway, about as close as you can come. And so John was working with this, and again, it was typical of his way of getting to the heart of these things and finding the place where he could get the maximum information with the least possible effort, all of which was very nice. John had a way of, first of all, he had always had a very clear picture of what he was after. He knew what he was trying to do, and he was very perceptive with respect to determining how to get the information he wanted with the least possible effort, as well as in the best possible form and with the least possible, at the same time, with the least possible effort. In discussing with him about 3 years ago the question of language translation, I found that he was working with that, and that what he was doing was comparing the legislation published in English by, I'm getting all mixed up, I'm going to do this over again. Let me do it over.
Okay.
John was very skillful at, on the one hand, knowing exactly what kind of information he would need for a particular task, and on the other hand, for ascertaining how he could get this information in the best possible form with the least possible amount of effort. About 3 years ago, I had occasion to discuss language translation with him, and we got to discussion of French and English, and he told me what he was doing in this regard, which was to analyze, to compare the legislation in English with that in French that was being produced in Quebec, where they're bilingual and where the laws were required to be published in both languages. And so he had found an ideal case. He had a large amount of material to work with, and it was all delivered to him on a silver platter, which was typical of the way he went about it. So he was getting the most out of he possibly could out of with the least possible effort. The essence of John's style is that there are several aspects. First of all, his erudition is unquestioned. So everybody understands that without question that when he discusses things or that he's thought them through, and his background and knowledge are very, very good. So in anything that he gets into, he's very, very highly respected. At the same time, John is the kind of person, he's a humble sort of person in the sense that he will work with people who don't fully understand what he is thinking about. He's a very good teacher with respect to explaining to other people. He can sense what other people don't know and explain to them what it is he's really thinking about. So that he becomes a very good team player at the same time. And then he is simply a very likable person, a very gentle, likable person. And I've never known anybody who didn't like John and who didn't instantly find him to be a friend. With respect to the environment that we were involved with, what had happened was that we had, the laboratory had gone through a succession of projects. And these had resulted in the 701 computer, the 702, and the 704 for scientific purposes, and the 702 and the 705 for business purposes. But these machines were, even though they were made out of the same kinds of parts, they were very different machines. They were structured the same, and a card reader that would work on one of them wouldn't work on the other. A printer that worked for one wouldn't work on the other. The tapes for one wouldn't work on the other. And so we were in a position where, as we looked ahead, it didn't make sense to continue. We were at the sort of the end of the road. To proceed to try and make more machines of these kinds was clearly carrying us in poor directions. At the same time, we knew that transistors were going to replace vacuum tubes, but we hadn't yet gotten transistors that were adequate for the purpose. We hadn't the technology. We knew it was coming over the hill, and that we'd gone about as far as we could with vacuum tubes. And so there was this general environment of recognition that we had big problems, but that we didn't know the solutions to these problems. That there were problems of such magnitude that we didn't see simple solutions for them. And the first thing from my standpoint, I came to Poughkeepsie in 1954, and the year before I had headed up the technical part of a sales group that sold the first computer for business purposes down in Washington. I'd spent a year working on that, and so after that I came to Poughkeepsie and joined the laboratory, and there were three of us that would get together for a coffee clutch with a blackboard, and one was Gene Amdahl and Werner Buchholz and myself. And we had no authority, no one behind us. We just would stand there with chalk and cups of coffee and talk to one another about how to approach the various problems that seemed that required solution, but for which we didn't really know answers. And as we went into that, the laboratory decided in the summer, Ralph Palmer, who was then head of the development laboratory, called about 20 of us and said we weren't going on vacation that year. That instead of having, the plant had a vacation, a regular vacation period that we all went. Instead of taking vacation that time, we were all going to get together and decide what we were going to do about the next generation of computers from the hardware standpoint. I still have, after we left one of those discussions, I tore the sheets off the yellow pad. I still have them in a trunk up in my attic, showing the cycle times that we had figured would be possible with transistorized machines and what we could accomplish in that direction. And from that, the laboratory got the direct word that we had to start with this and had to go. A direct order came down that no one was allowed to be seen with vacuum tube equipment. No one was allowed to have any on a bench. If you wanted to work on vacuum tube equipment, you had to hide it. Literally, physically had to hide it. And that was the way in which the word was gotten through to everybody, that they couldn't fall back on vacuum tube, what they knew about vacuum tubes. If they ran into a problem with transistors they didn't know how to solve. They had to solve their problems. And so that's sort of the way in which we went around about it. But we didn't have enough money. The corporation didn't see it quite the way we in engineering saw it, and there wasn't the money available for us to do the things we wanted. So I had spent the war years at the National Security, what was at the Signal Corps, which was the predecessor of the National Security Agency. Ralph Palmer had spent the war years in the naval equivalent of that. So we'd both been cryptanalysts during World War II, and so at that we knew how desperately those people wanted advanced technology. So we went back to them and said and proposed to them that they share with us the funding of this technology. And so the first transistor technology, the first fast transistor technology, we had had slower transistors before, but the first technology involving fast transistors and the first technology involving fast ferrite memories driven by transistors was actually funded by what was by then the National Security Agency. And so that's where we got the first money, and it was by doing such things as that that we got our start. By that time, we began to understand what the possibilities were in terms of the transistor speeds and things of that sort, and could see that the stretch project would be possible. So the Atomic Energy Commission was looking for a high-speed computer for their own purposes as well. So our next step was to go to them, and we went to Teller and at the Livermore laboratory, and made a proposal to them. And as I understood it from our proposal, the they liked our proposal better. We thought that ours was better than the one that was offered by Sperry Rand, but Sperry Rand was giving them an earlier delivery date, and so it had to go. They were such a pressing need that it had to go the other way. I might say at this point that we delivered Stretch before the Lark was delivered. But be that as it may, we didn't. We lost that opportunity. However, at this point, John von Neumann stepped forward and said, I would like you to do this at Los Alamos. And so at that point, we entered into a contract with the Atomic Energy Commission at Los Alamos, and we did this through John von Neumann. He was the one they looked to more than anyone else for guidance in computers, and it was Cuthbert Hurd who headed the negotiation with von Neumann. I was with Cuthbert in discussing these things with von Neumann from time to time, but it was Cuthbert Hurd who actually headed the discussion with von Neumann. This is what led us to build the machine, the first of the Stretch machines for Los Alamos. We then saw that we could get orders for other machines, which we did, and we also designed a machine for the National Security Agency. This was called the Harvest Machine, and that was their cover name for it. And it involved, we did some things for them that we didn't do for anyone else. We had a half microsecond high-speed memory. Our regular memory had a 2 microsecond cycle. We had a half microsecond cycle memory for them. They had actually provided us with support for developing it, and so we did that. And we developed cartridge loading tapes and a means of automatically loading them into the machine so that the machine could proceed hour after hour, changing its own tape, so there was no time lost while it was using one tape, it was planning which one would be next and ordering it out of the cache. And so that was another of the firsts that we had with the Stretch project, was our cartridge tapes and automatic loading of cartridge tapes, which we only did for that machine. Later on, they asked for a second machine, but IBM never produced it for them. To have produced a second one was too much of an undertaking, and by then there were other things that we could have done because the technology was moving ahead very rapidly, and it wasn't a good thing to do, to go back and do what had been done before. So they've gotten other machines, but they didn't get a second Stretch machine. Well, over a period of time, it became very obvious that the Stretch machine not only was a very powerful machine, but it was also a very reliable machine. And so at one point, the National Security Agency violated their first precept of security, and they had a party for their Stretch machine. And there was a similar party for the Stretch machine that went to Los Alamos. And so the Stretch machine has had several parties for itself along the way. And these were great fun and were some compensation for the amount of effort that we all put into the thing. However, the real compensation we got was from knowing that we were covering new ground and that we were setting standards for the future for computers. And out of Stretch, let me say that, in my opinion, the first and foremost contribution that the Stretch project made was in bringing into IBM a number of people like John Cocke who very well might not have been attracted otherwise. And I can name a number of those people. Fred Brooks is one of them. John Cocke is a second. Harwood Kolsky is another. Jim Pomerine is another such person. And there were many, Sully Campbell, T.C. Chen, and many more. At one time I counted we had 17 people with doctoral degrees on the project, on the one project. The project, incidentally, was a fluid one. It went through stages. We'd have a stage in which we were working on circuits, another in which we were working on circuit cards, another in which we would be working on general design, memories, and so forth. And these overlapped. And these were not all done as one project. They were farmed out. For example, the disk file is an example of that. Up to the time Stretch came along, we didn't have any disk files of the kind we now have. There was an earlier one in which individual arms would move in and out and up and down. They had another dimension of movement, and they were too slow, too cumbersome, too awkward, and they just didn't work well. Also, they wouldn't work for Stretch because the information rate wasn't fast enough. So we specified files of the kind that are in use today for the San Jose Laboratory, and set them up with $1 million to produce the first one. And so those files were then used by Stretch, and they were provide the foundation for the American Airlines Sabre system, for example, and for other systems since then. It's interesting that there are certain things, while many aspects of Stretch have been picked up, there are certain things that haven't been picked up. We had the problem with Stretch that we needed to get information in and out of the machine very much faster than was possible by any means up to that time. That led us to the disk file in which we had heads which moved in and out, but there was a head on each disk surface at all times, and we, in the Stretch machine, we read them all at once. We read 38 heads at once, and because that would obviously never work on the face of it without something else, we had what was called automatic skew elimination, so that we could line the bits up electronically as they came off the head, so that if one head was a little off from the others, it would correct it. And we also had automatic error correction, so if it couldn't read it, it would correct it. And this was all done automatically as it went along. The machine didn't stop if it had an error; it just fixed it and went on. John Cocke is a unique combination of a number of things. First of all, he's a person of very high intellect, and so he's always out in front of the rest of us, thinking about things and looking into the future and analyzing things that haven't occurred to the rest of us. So it's always very refreshing to be around John. Another factor with John is that he's very well grounded academically. He knows his business, and it is just it's in his pores, and education has taken very well with John. Then he's just a very nice person. He's a pleasant person to be around. He's fun to be around. Anyone with him, around him, always has a good time when they're around him. I've never known anybody who disliked him for any reason. He's not abrasive. He's quite the opposite. And he fits in with groups, and he understands quickly what a group wants to do and makes his contribution to the group, and does it in a quiet, unassuming way, and tends not to do these things in such a way that others will accept what he has to say and listen to him. And everybody recognizes these characteristics in John. They kind of show in so many respects that he has the utmost respect of the individuals and groups that he is working with. And so it's always a pleasure to work with him, and you always have a feeling that you're accomplishing something when you do it. We went to, John went to Los Alamos many times. I did, Fred Brooks, others. And so we got quite well acquainted with the area, and from time to time we would take these take a break when we had an opportunity, say over a weekend, and take a jaunt off to do something. And I recollect, for example, taking trips on horseback with John up and down Frijoles Canyon, and looking down and wondering if we'd ever make it back to the base, hoping the horse would have better sense than we did. we were so busy during those periods that we didn't spend too much time in recreation. It was just an occasional trip like that one that would stand out. I think John's work has had a very substantial influence on other people, and I think the work that was done in designing the structure of Stretch and the way, and particularly not the particular design that came out, but the way in which it was gone about, set new standards for that sort of thing, and the use of simulation in a machine of that sort was something new at that time. It's something we will always use in the future. It's as important today as it was then, and it's a thing that John has done more recently as well, and it will be going on into the future, because what you have is, first of all, some hardware that has certain characteristics that you more or less have to stay within. You have certain physical bounds that you have to stay within on the one side. On the other side, you have a set of goals, certain things you want to accomplish. And these things, now the hardware is changing all the time as time goes on. The goals are changing all the time, expanding all the time. And one must continually reassess how one relates one's goals to the specific tools that one has at hand. And this aspect of what we called look ahead then, but really was more broadly the question of how do you bring these two extremes together, the application, the desires to do things on one hand and the hardware on the other, is a continuing thing that will continually change. Certainly when we did it, we didn't in any way anticipate the kinds of hardware that we have today, nor did we fully anticipate the range of applications that we would have, the extent to which computers are being used in the creation of visual images and in the resolution of images and things of that sort. Certainly we may have guessed that it might happen, but we had no knowledge of how far it would go, and certainly we're not gone as far as we will. So what John did is going to be done again and again in new context again and again from now on. And so he did the first work on something that will continue. Certain things that were done, decisions were made, more or less stick with time. That's one of the things that doesn't stay with time. It's forever changing with time. And I would like to say something about, I'd like to address the younger people who will see this videotape. They will look at John's accomplishments and say, he had these opportunities a third of a century ago, he's taken good advantage, but how about myself? How do I relate to all of this? And what is the future? Where does the future lie for me? It's very clear that at this time of Stretch, we had an unusual, special opportunity. And I think Shakespeare said it all when he said, there is a time in the affairs of men when taken at the flood, leads, I can't say it.
Leads on to victory?
What?
There's a time in the affairs of men.
I wrote it down.
Leads on to
Here, let
victory.
me. Yes, that's right. Let me get it, and then I want to repeat it.
Yes, we'll say
I looked it
Very
up.
nice.
I looked it up because it's absolutely true.
Isn't it lovely?
For a young person reviewing John Cocke's career in IBM, it's natural to ask the question of what does this mean for me? This was fine for him. He had all these opportunities a third of a century ago, and he's used them very, very well. But what lies ahead for me from here on in? And it seems to me that we have as many opportunities today as there were for John a third of a century ago for influencing the future of computers. Shakespeare has said that there's a tide in the...
There's so much noise going on out there, I'm going to have to
All right.
force you through it one
No,
more
that's
time.
all right. It's no problem if they don't
What
just
is
run out of
called-
tape or something.
No, we just started a new one.
I'm going to start over with this
Yes,
rather than try and...
exactly. No, I
okay.
want you to start over again.
For any young person looking at John's career, it's very natural to ask the question, what does this mean to me? It was all fine for John. He had these opportunities a third of a century ago. He's taken advantage of them over this third of a century. But what lies ahead? Do I have an equal opportunity? And it seems to me that people do. It isn't to say that every time is as good as any other. Shakespeare said that there is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. That was true when John came with IBM. We were at one of those periods of very rapid change, and he used that opportunity, and other people used that opportunity. It seems to me that we're really at the same point. The tide is now turning, and we have opportunities today that we didn't have ever before. These opportunities come in slightly different directions, and it seems to me that they're primarily in the field of software, and that there is as much opportunity today for influencing the future by the development of new and better software techniques as there was at that time in the things that John did. They're the same opportunities for examining the structure of computers and determining how we will use language to tell our computer to do the things we want it to do, and how we will structure the computer so that it will understand us when we tell it what we want to do. So it would seem to me that we're going to see as much change in the next third of a century as we have seen in the last, and that we're not by any means at the end of this process of evolution. We may only still be at the very beginning. We certainly haven't reached the midpoint. As a researcher, as a research person, John always had the ability to crystallize the goals, the question that was being asked, and to examine and determine the most simple and direct way, most economical way to arrive at answers to it. He was very, very skilled at that kind of thing, which is to say at the evaluation of problems and at the evaluation of solution of problems, and that made him very efficient at this sort of thing. He very often came up with solutions and insights into problems that other people didn't see, or come up with them well in front of other people because of these abilities of his. Sure. Oh, John could be anywhere at any time, and so you know, a call at 11 o'clock at night was just in the middle of the day for him. You know, no, and sure, no, he worked at all kinds of hours, and he was not particularly inclined to be fully aware of the fact that someone else might be eating dinner or something else of that sort at the time. And he called when it seemed appropriate to him, was when the problem came to his mind, which might be at 11 o'clock at night. First of all, I can only evaluate his early contributions to Stretch, and his contribution there was that he did a great deal in defining the structure of the machine that would be efficient, and in the way in defining the way in which problems should be stated to take advantage of that structure to achieve the results that the people were after. So he had a major influence on the design, on the overall structural design of the Stretch machine and how the various parts of the machine would work together. And you have to bear in mind that this was the first machine that was multiplex in that respect. This was the first machine in which the parts of the machine didn't all work sequentially. They worked together rather than sequentially, and this was a new thing for all of us. And so problems that we kind of take for granted now were unsolved problems at that time.